Good afternoon. My name is Vani from the U.S. Institute of Peace. And I understand that our panel is the last panel before lunch, so we will try to not keep you waiting. But I thought I wanted to pick up maybe directly from Assistant Secretary Kendler's speech and follow up on some questions about export controls and sort of U.S.-led export controls. So Assistant Secretary Kendler, I heard a colleague once talk about in regards to AUKUS, talking about how we focus a lot on advancing technologies for blue and restraining technology for red, but we oftentimes don't talk as much about green, and that is sort of allies and partners. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about sort of what the impacts on some of the recent export controls, but more broadly, how that impacts partners and allies and what the U.S. does to mitigate some of those concerns or risks.
Sure, thank you. It's very important that we consider our allies and partners' needs as we craft export controls. And that's truly foremost in our minds. Even when you talk about our recent semiconductor rules, the October 7th, 17th rules, we've been very, very careful to make sure that they do not apply to partners like India. And even when we have imposed controls on countries that may be not red or blue, it's to address the concern about, as you've put it, red operating outside of their own countries, not necessarily related to a concern with our ally or partner country. So ally and partner needs and common views of national security threats are truly foremost in our minds as we craft controls.
Thank you. So maybe Additional Secretary Rao, I can ask you a little bit about India's perception of export control regimes generally, but also the ways in which the U.S. and India are working together to maybe navigate emerging technology cooperation. Could you talk a little bit about the potential bilateral initiatives like ISET and how that sort of both enhances the cooperation, maybe inoculates India from some of the concerns it has?
Thank you, Samir. And it's a pleasure to be here with Assistant Secretary Kendler. Samir, Assistant Secretary Kendler mentioned some statistics about bilateral trade, and I just want to build on that. Presently, we have bilateral trade with the US standing at about almost $200 billion per annum. But high-tech trade is a minuscule portion of that, at below $6 billion per annum. So there is huge potential for augmenting that. And in the post-COVID scenario, discussions between the two countries have shifted. There is, in fact, an entirely new lexicon. We are discussing about supply chains, critical minerals, resilient and trusted technologies. And this has found expression in the form of a new platform, the Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies that was announced last year by the two leaders. What it seeks to do is forge collaborations in these domains, AI, semiconductors, telecom, defense, and quantum computing, just to mention a few. And we are trying to do that by bringing together not just the two governments, but also, most importantly, the industry, the innovation ecosystem, and the R&D fraternity in both countries. Now, look at what happened in the last 1.5 years in this domain. You know, we have this unprecedented announcement about GE enabling transfer of technology, almost 80% for the 414 engine for our light combat aircraft. We are discussing co-production of this infantry combat vehicle called the Striker. We are discussing procurement of MQ-9B. Many high-tech defense and other procurements are in the pipeline. And we are also taking steps to enable commercial space collaboration. So what does it mean in terms of bilateral trade and how it is structured? So we see in the coming months and years possibility of strategic trade increasing many times over. And when we do that, there will be naturally issues pertaining to dual use items, items in the munitions list. And there are opportunities here for not just India to import, but for Indian companies and entities to work with their US counterparts in co production, co development, and other activities. And in this entire spectrum of activities, naturally, we will have to navigate the US policy regimes pertaining to ITAR and EAR. And our expectation as governments is that we facilitate that process as much as possible. We help the companies navigate that process, particularly the small companies, startups, which do not have the wherewithal to do so. So there are many ways in which we are doing that. We have started this dialogue, strategic trade dialogue, which will address some of these policy issues. We are looking at more awareness building exercises. Thea Kendler did an excellent workshop yesterday. We need to continue that work. There will also be specific cases that we are taking up from time to time with the US government. But overall, this will be an ongoing exercise. Obviously, as trade is reorienting to these new priorities, we need to be nimble in our bilateral efforts also, and to be able to facilitate that interaction between the two sides. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Baum, I wanted to turn to you to talk a little bit about, from an academic perspective, your assessment of the October 7th export controls. So what is the technology theory that you think is behind this? And is it feasible to significantly set back China by targeting critical choke points?
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you. Yeah, so I think it's, first of all, I think it's important to call out that the October 7th and 17th sanctions are quite a significant development in the export control history of export controls. I think it's probably the first time that we try to control the dissemination of a general purpose technology like IT and AI via export controls. That's a pretty bold step. The problem that I see is it's probably we're overemphasizing export controls as a tool to achieve geopolitical goals. And the reason why I think it's overemphasized is that there is a certain technology theory behind these export controls that is, I think, highly problematic. We traced this actually as part of the book project, where the book's going to be published soon. We traced it back to some academic papers that are describing technology value chains and so-called choke points within these technology value chains. So this idea that within the technology value chains, there are certain parts of it that could be weaponized, that could be used for export controls to control the dissemination of technology. It went from academia into the National Security Commission on AI papers that is mentioning choke points 14 times, I think, in 2021. So it became this kind of common sense in politics that you could use these choke points to control technology. When you talk to industry, however, the perception of how technology works is actually completely different. So if you talk to industry leaders, they're basically, everyone is paranoid, right, about their technological advantages, because everybody feels that any kind of advantage that you have is very, it's a fleeting moment, it's very fragile, and it needs to be basically protected by running faster than anyone else. So the very idea of using these technological advantages, and they might seem to be huge, like in the cases of NVIDIA right now or ASML, from an industry perspective, these advantages are rather minimal and could easily be flipped. And that's the main concern that you hear from industry when they think about these export controls, that we're basically betting on something that is rather fragile and therefore might not achieve the geopolitical goals that were anticipated. So in that regard, I think it's important to keep in mind that the core part of geopolitical statecraft right now, these October 7th export controls, might actually be less effective than many anticipate, simply because technology is not as static as assumed by many policymakers.
So, Assistant Secretary Kendler, I'd love to give you an opportunity to take on this question as well. So, what is the potential or risk of actually accelerating China's development of advanced semiconductor chips and artificial intelligence? And I imagine there was a tremendous amount of deliberation and thought that was put into the October 7th controls. What was the theory behind how we preserve our advantage?
Thank you. I really appreciate the comments you just provided. It's really helpful to stress test our work and make sure that we are doing the best we can to protect national security. I would quibble, and I'll get to your question, but I would quibble with a couple of statements. First, that this is a general purpose control. We've been very calibrated in how we define the technology subject to the October 7th, 17th rules to make sure that we are only addressing advanced semiconductor chips and the equipment to manufacture them, and not to touch legacy chips at all. And I think that's very consistent with the approach through the Wassenaar arrangement to export controls. We've always, to borrow Joint Secretary Rao's statement, the word nimble. We've always required nimble export controls. What's happening now is that technology is changing, and we must be even more nimble to address the new national security threat, military threat posed by new technology. So in terms of, I think, your question's really about sort of indigenous development. In the structure of our rulemaking, we are controlling not just the chips, but also the equipment used to manufacture the most advanced chips. And that is a little bit new or novel. And that is exactly getting at the issue of indigenous production. In addition to that, I would say that our efforts to really think holistically about the technology ecosystem and where pieces come from and who our partners are, sort of our international approach to this is absolutely critical. And that's also consistent with our past engagements.
So maybe, Mr. Baum, I can follow up with you. I take your point about sort of the uncertainty about whether these choke points will work. But to Assistant Secretary Kendler's point, like, what's the probability that China actually is able to produce an ASML over the next 5-10 years and start its own, sort of have the equipment that's necessary for these probably the most complex machines in the world? And then maybe on top of that, what I'd like to ask is, what's the alternative, right? I mean, granted, there's a lot of vulnerabilities in export controls, there's a lot of risks, and even risk of backfire or just like insolvency. But what other choices were out there that we should be thinking about or debating, considering?
Okay, yeah, absolutely valid question. So I think the main problem of the whole exercise is that we provide China what it lacked before, which is necessity and removal of choice. So think about it from a Chinese chip user perspective. So if you're a Chinese high-tech company, you were very reluctant to bet on native Chinese chips because better chips were available, right? So you could use an NVIDIA chip. So why would you bother with a 3 generations behind Chinese native GPU or whatever product, right? So until recently, Chinese companies were very happy to use these Western chips. Now with these controls, there is no choice anymore. So Chinese companies are have to use Chinese native semiconductors, and that is basically removing a choice point, which means we are strengthening the Chinese ecosystem inherently. So as you might know, China has tried to build up a native semiconductor industry for years. It has been a huge waste of money until recently. So Big Fund 1 and Big Fund 2, $50 billion investments by Chinese government into semiconductors led to large-scale corruption cases like Tsinghua, Unigroup, basically a waste of money. Why? Because it wasn't really a priority and there was this choice. You could get better chips internationally. Now we made sure that both conditions are removed. So you have full attention of the Chinese leadership on the semiconductor industry. So you could argue like the eye of Sauron is now clearly fixed on native semiconductor companies. So you could bet that Big Fund 3 will be much more effective than Big Fund 1 and 2, because it has to be. And Chinese companies like Huawei, who are basically also users of these chips, will drag a whole ecosystem of native Chinese companies along developing this native semiconductor IT system. So in that sense, I think the export controls, unfortunately, provide an incentive system that's very detrimental to what is supposed to be achieved in the first place, as we basically inject steroids into the semiconductor ecosystem in China. And that's not a good development if you think of it from the geopolitical goals perspective, right? So I think that's a problem. You could argue it's a little bit similar to a de-dollarization, what's going on right now. So basically, China is designing out Western tech because of export controls, and that means we trade a short-term advantage over long-term influence where China is going. And I wonder if that's really our geopolitical ambition, if that aligns well to the goals that we have. That was the first question. Second question is, what are the alternatives? Actually, I think the national security strategy, I think it was 2021, actually framed it pretty well, right? It's now regarded as this kind of naive, like, oh, this running faster strategy that we always had didn't work with China. I think it's still the right strategy. US tech is very competitive. Western tech is very competitive, and we need to stay ahead of the game. So I wonder if we're not, like, by pouring concrete basically into the innovation ecosystem with controlling ASML and NVIDIA and etc., if we're not really hurting ourselves more than getting an advantage over China. So in that regard, I'm a little bit of a retro guy, and I think the old industrial policy strategy of the US actually worked quite well. And last word on GPT. I think you're right. The controls were targeted. The point is, in the end, what I would describe AI is a general purpose technology. So it's one of those major technology innovations that is influencing everything, right? So general purpose technologies are great because they provide huge benefits to productivity, etc. The problem with these guys is they are very, very hard to control, right? So if we know one thing from history, like look at the steam engine, look at the combustion engine, you cannot control the spread of general purpose technologies. It's just too fluid, too important, and therefore I think it's a very, let's say, ambitious bet to somewhat influence the spread of GPTs via export controls. It has never been tried in the past, so it's we're living in exciting times from an export controls perspective.
Well, we'll get back to this conversation, but I would imagine that there's some history and what we've learned during the Cold War and the use of the Coordinating Committee on Export Controls did seem to have some pretty profound effects on the Soviet Union and sort of holding it back for at least generation to multiple generations. But we can get to that. I apologize, Mr. Sandler. I've left you out of the conversation. I want to bring you into it and ask you a little bit, broadly about the EU's perspective on export controls and sort of the new waves of U.S. export controls, but also a follow-on question about potential backlash in other industries and domains. So while the recent U.S. export control measures have targeted advanced semiconductors, there's certain areas like batteries and photovoltaic cells, green technology, that are overwhelmingly dominated by China in the green supply chain. So is there a risk of successive export control measures and countermeasures initiated by the U.S. and China that can imperil these green technologies that the EU is very invested in?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks for letting me participate in this great panel. I think from a European perspective, but we're also hearing it from what Taya is saying and others. I mean, the challenge at the moment is to respond to a very different geopolitical context and also the unprecedented speed of technology and the changes that we are seeing, and trying to shape the instruments and tools which can help us respond to that. Within the European Union, we've set out just before the summer a European economic security strategy, and that has a number of different strands to it. And I think that picks up a bit on Ansgar's point that there's a risk of overemphasizing what export controls can do on their own in offering a solution. They are part of the solution, and I think they're a solution driven primarily by security concerns, and that's the right thing, that these should be tools which allow us to address particular immediate security risks. And there I agree very much with Taya. That's also the European Union's idea, that in shaping controls, whether it's through the multilateral regimes or whether it's through increasing unilateral action, you have to be precise, you have to be proportionate, you have to be targeted. I think for business, that is what they expect, at least from policymakers. On the issue of the kind of the impacts that it has and the risk of backlash, of course, that is a major concern in different forms. First of all, the level of integration that we see in the context of globalization is very different from where we were during the Cold War and when you had the COCOM regime in place. The integration is real. It's substantial throughout the value chain. So one of the things that we're particularly concerned about is watching for extraterritorial effects and how those impact different parts of the value chain. And that can have a real effect within Europe. The last thing I'd say is that we're conscious equally that in reaction to measures that might be taken multilaterally or unilateral actions, it's quite possible that China or others can turn off the taps for certain inputs or raw materials, and that's also a real cause for concern. On the other hand, given that these are policy responses driven by security, our starting point has to be looking at those security needs and trying to find ways to address them. And sometimes, indeed, it's exactly that trade-off between short-term and long-term, and the short-term risks are tending to prevail, particularly in the current geopolitical context.
Great. Maybe I can pivot back to Additional Secretary Rao. And Ansgar talked a little bit about the previous strategy was about just running faster. And I wonder if running faster can mean running faster with partners like India. So in two ways. So one is, for many semiconductor companies, China is an attractive market because it's a source of revenue. And a substantial portion of that revenue gets plowed back into R&D, which gives these companies a leading edge. Is it possible that India becomes that new market and can start to make up for the loss of the Chinese market? But on top of that, can India also be a partner innovator in this industry as well?
Thank you, Samir. India is overall an importer of chips, and most of them have been imported from one country. So when the COVID pandemic took place, we felt the impact of the shortage of chips very directly. And I think many of us saw the delays in the auto manufacturing sector. So India took a decision to augment its own ecosystem to de-risk our supply chain. As a result of that, we announced this Indian semiconductor mission, which is not only trying to strengthen this ecosystem for our domestic demand, but also it's positioning India as a trusted global supplier. Now, where do we stand in this ecosystem? Our domestic requirements are increasing. We are strengthening our critical sectors of manufacturing, such as defense and electronics, and space and other, all of which need semiconductor elements. So we have announced this mission, which provides a lot of fiscal incentives for companies to invest. The state governments in India are also supporting foreign companies which are trying to set up operations in India. And just in terms of estimates, by 2026, our semiconductor industry is estimated to stand at almost $64 billion. Now, where do we go, with partners like the US? Obviously, under this new platform called ISET, semiconductors was a focus area. And I'm happy to share that just this year, 5 US semiconductor companies have announced investments or expansion of operations in India. And they are in the entire spectrum, including training India's workforce. The second point is the role that India can play in providing a talented workforce. Almost 20% of the global semiconductor design workforce is based in India, including many for working for the US companies. So again, that's one area where we can play a role. Obviously, our ecosystem of this entire ecosystem. Overall, partnerships are being forged on the basis of trust and shared values. But more than that, I think the industry looks at India as a destination which is commercially viable, where there is ability to scale, there is a very skilled workforce, and an excellent R&D ecosystem. So all of these elements put together, I think, work for India and also for partnerships with countries like the US.
Thank you. So Assistant Secretary Kendler, I want to pick up on some of the points that Mr. Sandler made and get your thoughts on particularly the sort of the caution about having precision targeting of export controls. And was the Cold War really that different that doesn't offer any models or templates for how to think about export controls in this day and age if we're so integrated in our supply chains? And then maybe a third sort of part of his point that I thought was interesting was to hear about how we evaluate short-term versus long-term sort of trade-offs and benefits as well.
Sure, I think each one of those topics probably warrants a good hour in it each. The precision of our controls is always something that we look for. We are never interested in controls that go beyond the national security or regional stability needs, because that would interfere with business functions, and that's not the purpose of our controls. We control to the narrowest extent possible to accomplish our goals. And I can't speak for what happened in the Cold War, but I can't imagine that we would. I mean, my bureau is housed in the Department of Commerce. I can't imagine that we would be sitting in the Department of Commerce if that hadn't been the vision all along, that we would try for narrow, targeted controls. In terms of long-term versus short-term, I think what's true for export controls, even though it's an economic tool, is the same as true for all national security considerations. There are trade-offs, and we do our best to balance the short-term and long-term. This is not we're doing the best we can. We may have to sort of round some corners rather than squaring them, right? But to accomplish our national security goals, this is necessary.
Mr. Sandler, can I come back to you and ask a little bit about whether there's an emerging discussion that I think has sort of been put out there in the sort of idea space by former U.S. officials, but whether there's a potential need for a new formal plurilateral export control regime amongst techno-democracies, democracies that sort of have advanced technological prowess, and whether that's sort of something we need in addition to the existing sort of 4 export control regimes at present.
I think it is true to say that at the moment we're going through a moment of change, and that the current export control regimes, which are the first best option, developing a kind of international public good which works overall, are under strain. And they're under strain because of geopolitical tensions, are under strain because sometimes the technology is moving much faster than the regimes, even when they're working fully, are able to deliver. So I think it's right that countries with security interests look at ways of working together and of trying to shape the right sort of solutions. We've seen that in the context of events in Ukraine, with the coalition and the close cooperation that's been between a range of like-minded countries in terms of the response to those events. And that's maybe presenting different routes to try to resolve some of the challenges which are out there. But it's not necessarily about developing a new formal regime or a new approach. It's using a variety of different tools which are available, which can include export controls, but are not necessarily limited to those, to try to address some of the challenges, security challenges that we're facing.
Does anyone else want to take on this question of technology regimes and techno-democracies, Ansgar?
Yeah. Maybe shortly back to the Cold War parallels here. So we call our book The Tech Cold War because we think there are some important lessons to learn. Doesn't mean we promise victory, right? That's important. Just because it's a Cold War doesn't mean you win it. But I think if you compare, arguably, what was more important for the outcome of the original Cold War? Was it export controls like COCOM, #1? Or were it the inherent contradictions of the Soviet Union economic system, which just couldn't cope with innovation because it was so centrally planned and in the end couldn't provide that kind of innovation ecosystem that was so important when the first generation of compute was developed? I would argue it was the latter. Export controls were not key to win the Cold War because export controls are always very limited in their impact. So I'd argue, looking at the inherent contradictions of China and let them make their mistakes, and Xi's centrally planned approach is highly problematic, I think, needs to be proven if it's successful. I think that's a much more interesting framing looking at China. Never stop an adversary from making mistakes, right? In the end, the problem with the export controls is we just provided a success environment for the semiconductor industry by removing choice. So we're doing the opposite. So I'm concerned that we didn't learn the right lesson from the original Cold War here, right? With regard to export control regime, etc., I think there is a value in thinking about a COCOM 2.0. I think Wassenaar arrangement has its limits. The situation that the US went bilaterally to the Dutch government and to the Japanese government to basically implement the October 7th rules with their international partners to get ASML behind, etc., was a little bit problematic, especially from a European perspective. It would have been much better if there would have been a European position, because countries like Germany, who is is a supplier of ASML, so there were many other countries affected as well who weren't at the table, right? So from a European perspective, I think a COCOM 2.0 mechanism would kind of make sense. Call it economic NATO, however, but I think we need more institutionalization of the topic of export controls to make it a little bit, basically to avoid that export controls become a contentious topic within the transatlantic alliance. So we need that coordination in order to strengthen the alliance rather than weakening it. Now, one last point, I think what the limiting factor of export controls is usually overlooked, which is the role of corporations. Corporations do not act patriotically, right? That's not their business. They're there to make money. And this is something where I'm a little bit puzzled by a couple of statements from the US, like McGallagher is calling for patriotic companies. I don't think that's the DNA of US capitalism, asking companies to act patriotically. If you look at history again, look at the situation where you had like one rising power and one defending global power. Great Britain versus the German Empire before World War I. If you look at the dynamics between these governments and their corporations, it's an interesting dynamic because it led to the situation where the controls implemented by Great Britain were opposed by British companies, right? So they were keen to trade with Germany. So insurance companies, banks, infrastructure companies, they were all basically pushing back against Great Britain's policies against Germany, the empire. At the same time, in Germany, the situation led to a greater alignment between corporations and the German government, because in the end they were pushing back and therefore having a very much, let's say, an aligned outlook on the world between the German government and German companies. And I think exactly the same is happening right now. In China, you see a greater alignment because the Chinese government is now even supporting more the semiconductor industry. In the US, you have exactly the same like in the UK back in the 19th century, where US companies are actively pushing back against US policies because they don't like it. So if you look at NVIDIA, they are producing now export-controlled optimized chips just below the threshold. If you look at Tesla, Tesla is going all in China. They're investing hugely there in software development, battery, etc., to become less vulnerable to US export controls, meaning they are doubling down in China. They're doing now more R&D in China, doing the data management in China, localizing data, etc. So to a certain degree, export controls of the dominant power like the US are limited by the natural interests of their companies who will push back against these controls. And therefore, I think it will be just want to say, like, the tool of export controls has its natural limits and it shouldn't be overextended. So we would be wise to think about geopolitical strategy beyond export controls. We will be disappointed if we only bet on export controls. That's the main point.
Okay, so Secretary Kendler, can you maybe sort of take that on and address, like, what is your experience in seeing sort of corporations' adherence to in sort of support of national security interests? And then also the broader challenge that I think Ansgar is alluding to is like how do we keep the coalition together and aligned on these efforts?
Sure. Now, of course, anytime we put export controls in effect, companies are impacted. And generally speaking, we try very hard to take industry input into account through issuing proposed rules or interim final rules that give industry an opportunity to comment. And it's very important to us to work closely with industry, as I noted in my remarks. Without the cooperation of industry, export controls are not effective. And what I find from US companies in practice is that they are compliant with our controls. They do not want to be hanging out there as violators of our controls. And I would say that this comes from a perspective not just of legal compliance, but in my experience, it's also a question of public perception of a company. And the idea that a company is identified as engaging in conduct that violates national security principles, that's not in the interest to see that headline on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. So while companies may make decisions that are not, quote unquote, patriotic, as you note, I don't think any company wants to find itself in a position where it's, for example, using the Russia example, where it's providing components for Russian drones. Even if that were lawful in some way, that's not a good look for a business, and they know that. In terms of international coalitions on export controls, we are eager to work with partners. We want, one of my, a former undersecretary of BIS talked about unilateral controls as damming half the river, right? There's no point in putting controls in if you're only going to create an unlevel playing field for business. We want controls that accomplish our objectives broadly. And we will work with whichever partners, which other technology partners we can identify to do so. There was a comment about regimes earlier, and I do just want to follow up and say that we're very committed to the 4 multilateral regimes. And with the point that we'll work with whoever we can partner with on emerging and critical technologies.
Mr. Sandler, I want to bring you back into the conversation. So Ansgar talked a little bit about how the decision for the Dutch to sort of align with this export control regime, or effort rather, was not sort of in keeping with like how maybe the EU might have approached this. So the EU-China strategic outlook from 2019 recognizes China as a competitor, but also a partner. So is sort of the Dutch position on this a little bit in tension with how the EU would want to approach semiconductor export controls?
I think with the Dutch measures, it was a reflection of the fact that, like most of the member states, there's a strong sense of them wanting to take steps to address their security concerns, their national security concerns themselves, to have that in their own hands. And that was an assessment that they made of the level of risk and the action that needed to be taken. I think for the European Union, there's a particular challenge. We're in internal market, 27 member states working together. And a lot of the hard regulatory power sits with the member states because the weight of national security in their decision making, that's entirely appropriate. But of course, what happens in one member state can also have impacts on the whole of the European Union. So there is a question or an issue we need to reflect on how the direction or the common interest of the European Union can best be addressed in the context of export controls, of the cooperation that exists multilaterally or internationally. But that's something which we hint at in our economic security strategy, and is something that we're now looking at how to get the current measures to work most effectively and to align them with the overall policy assessment of the risks that are out there. That said, I don't think there is a big difference in the approach followed by the Dutch from the more general assessment of the level of risk at a European level.
So, Additional Secretary Rao, I know this panel is oriented around export controls, but I'd like to talk about sort of the other side of the ledger, which is pooling of capabilities of capital and talent and innovation capacity. So could you speak a little bit about the U.S.-India strategic trade dialogue and how that's helping to pool those capabilities, technology transfer, but also talent flows as well?
Samir, the US-India discussions on strategic trade are not new. In the past, in 2002, we had this platform called the High Technology Cooperation Group, which addressed some of these issues. And then we signed the nuclear deal in 2008, so this dialogue did not renew thereafter. But, look at the issues that we are talking about now, the opportunities rather. We are talking about co-production, we are talking about co-development, innovation, and a range of activities between the industry of the two countries. And all of these, as I said earlier, will mean both countries having more trust in each other, looking at each other as reliable partners in the long term, and to be able to facilitate interactions between industry and the respective ecosystems, whether it is innovation, R&D, and others. Here, India has also a long track record of adhering to the export control regimes. We have a good, again, record of not diverting technologies or of proliferation, which is well known, end-use monitoring and other arrangements. These are on par, if I may say so, with that of other US allies. So all that needs to be taken on board. And overall, when there is a great sense of optimism and aspiration from industry on both sides, especially the high-tech industry, I think the governments need to be able to facilitate their enhanced interactions. If it is, by easing export controls, easing technology transfer, we would be willing to do that and work with the US government.
Great. Well, I see the time's up, sign, but I just want to say thank you to all our speakers. I think this was a very insightful conversation. I learned a lot, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.